That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day on the road became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we show that behind the engines and the leather, there are still human hearts. The desert wind howled low across the cracked asphalt of Route 17, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and distant rain. It was the kind of December dawn that clung to your bones, the sky a bruised grey over the low-slung buildings of Dustville, Arizona, a forgotten speck on the map where truckers paused and wanderers sometimes stayed too long. The Iron Hawks had rolled in the night before. Their bikes lined up like silent sentinels outside the Last Chance diner, engines cooling under a thin layer of frost. The club wasn't much for holidays, but this year they'd heard about the community's Christmas dinner, a potluck affair thrown together by the local church to feed the stragglers and the down-on-their-luck souls who called this stretch home. Jack Harlan, the man they called Nobody, pushed open the diner's back door at first light, his worn flannel shirt dusted with overnight chill. He was a fixture here, the janitor who'd shown up 2 years back with nothing but a duffel bag and a quiet nod to the owner, Maria. No one asked questions. In Dustville, questions were a luxury. Jack moved through the kitchen with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd learned to carry weight without complaint. His hands rough from years of grease and grit, knuckles scarred like old leather. He wiped down the counters, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, mingling with the drip of the coffee urn. The air smelled of stale grease and pine air freshener, a half-hearted nod to the season. Outside, the Iron Hawks stirred. Ray, the club's weathered president, swung his leg off his Harley, the kickstand scraping against the gravel. At 58, Ray's face was a map of sun-baked lines, his beard streaked with silver. He'd ridden with the Hawks for 3 decades, through bar fights and border runs, always preaching the code, protect your own. And sometimes that meant the forgotten ones on the edges. Beside him, Lena, the waitress who'd been with the diner since it opened in '89, poured black coffee into tin mugs, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice from a long night shift. "You boys staying for the dinner?" she asked, steam rising like ghosts in the cold air. Ray nodded, his eyes distant. "Heard it's for the kids. Can't say no to that." The diner filled slowly as the morning wore on. Mechanics from the garage down the road shuffled in, their coveralls stained with oil, trading nods with the bikers. There was Thomas, the single father who fixed transmissions by day and wondered at night how to explain his absences to his daughter. And old Mr. Ellis, the retired teacher who sat in the corner booth, nursing his coffee and staring at the highway like it owed him answers. The Christmas tree in the window was a spindly thing, lights flickering erratically, ornaments scavenged from garage sales. Jack moved among them unseen, sweeping floors, refilling salt shakers, his presence as unremarkable as the wind outside. They called him Nobody, not out of malice, but indifference, a whisper behind his back when he mopped up spills or hauled out trash. "Nobody knows where he came from," they'd say, and let it drop. By noon, the preparations for the dinner ramped up. Maria, with her apron tied tight and her dark hair pulled back, directed the chaos from the counter. Volunteers from the church arrived with casseroles and pies, the air thickening with the scent of cinnamon and baked ham. The Iron Hawks helped without fanfare. Ray carried in folding chairs, his boots thudding softly on the linoleum, while his vice, a quiet giant named Cole, strung garland along the walls. Cole's hands, massive and calloused, paused once as he caught sight of Jack in the corner, stacking plates. There was a flicker in Cole's eyes, recognition maybe, or just the weight of shared silences. But he said nothing, resuming his work with a slow exhale. The first heavy moment came unannounced, as these things often did. A young mother named Sarah, burst through the door, her coat clutched around a shivering boy of about 8. Rain had started, pattering against the windows like hesitant fingers, turning the asphalt slick and black. "Please!" Sarah gasped, her breath ragged, eyes darting to the empty booths. "We just need a place to wait out the storm. My car broke down a mile back." The boy, wide-eyed and clutching a threadbare backpack, looked up at the bikers with a mix of fear and curiosity. Ray's jaw tightened, but it was Jack who moved first. He set down his mop, the wooden handle leaning against the wall like a forgotten staff, and approached without a word. From the shadowed kitchen doorway, he watched the scene unfold, his chest rising in a measured breath. Sarah's hands trembled as she helped her son into a booth, the vinyl seats creaking under their weight. The diner fell into a hush, the hum of conversation fading like an engine idling down. Maria slid over a plate of cookies, her voice soft. "On the house. Warm up." But it was Jack who knelt beside the boy, pulling a small, folded blanket from his pocket, one he'd kept for nights when the desert cold seeped through his thin walls. He draped it over the child's shoulders, his fingers lingering just a moment, calloused tips brushing the fabric. The boy looked up, surprise softening his features, and Jack offered a nod, nothing more. No smile, no words, just the quiet act, heavy with unspoken care. Ray observed from across the room, his coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. The other hawks exchanged glances, the air charged with something unspoken. In their world, kindness wasn't broadcast. It was armor, worn under leather vests. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the roof, washing the road clean. Jack rose, returning to his tasks, but the moment hung there, a crack in the diner's weary facade. No one named it then, but it was the spark, the small gesture that would unravel secrets come evening, when the Christmas dinner unfolded and a man in a faded Santa suit arrived to stir the pot. The afternoon stretched, the diner a bubble against the storm. Laughter filtered in from the kitchen as volunteers arranged the long tablecloth-draped tables, but beneath it, tensions simmered. Thomas, wiping his hands on a rag, muttered to Cole about the town's whispers. The hawks were just drifters, trouble on 2 wheels. Cole's response was a low rumble, not anger, but resolve. "We ride for more than the road," Jack overheard, pausing with a dustpan in hand, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. The neon sign flickered to life as dusk approached, casting red and blue glows across the wet pavement. Last chance. For some, it was just a name. For others, a promise. As the first guests arrived for the dinner, coats shedding droplets, Jack slipped into the back, his shadow blending with the dim corners. The weight of the day settled on him like the desert dust, fine and inescapable. He didn't know it yet, but that blanket, that kneel, had set something in motion, a ripple through the room that would force truths to the surface. Truths about a man called Nobody, and the brotherhood that saw him when no one else did. The engines outside hummed faintly in the downpour, a reminder that the road never truly stopped, even in the quiet, before the storm broke wide open. The rain eased into a steady mist as evening crept over Dustville, turning the diner's windows into blurred mirrors of the world outside. Steam rose from the griddles in the kitchen, carrying the rich, savory scent of roasting turkey and simmering gravy that mingled with the damp earthiness seeping through the cracks in the door. Maria moved like a conductor through the controlled frenzy, her apron pockets bulging with spoons and recipe cards, directing the volunteers with nods and quiet words. "Table for the families on the left," she said to Lena, who balanced a tray of mashed potatoes, her arms aching from the weight, but her steps sure. Lena had been here through lean years, watching husbands leave and children grow up too fast. Her own life a series of small battles fought over double shifts and faded dreams. She set the tray down with a soft clatter, wiping sweat from her brow, and caught Jack's eye across the room. He was folding napkins at a side table, his movements precise, almost meditative, the paper crinkling under his scarred fingers. The Iron Hawks had claimed a corner booth, their leather jackets slung over the backs of chairs, vests patched with the club's emblem, a hawk in mid-flight, wings etched in faded thread. Ray sat with his elbows on the formica top, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, his gaze drifting to the boy, and Sarah now settled in a booth nearer the window. The child, Timmy, had warmed up, his cheeks flushed as he nibbled on a cookie, crumbs dusting his lap. Sarah's shoulders had relaxed a fraction, but her eyes still scanned the room, wary of the strangers who filled it. Ray knew that look. He'd seen it in too many faces along the endless stretches of highway, where trust was a currency harder to come by than gas. "Kid's got spirit," he murmured to Cole, who nodded, his massive frame hunched forward, fingers tracing the rim of his mug. Cole was the quiet one, a former mechanic who'd lost his shop to a fire years back, the kind of loss that hollowed you out without a sound. He carried it in the way he fixed things. Engines, fences, broken lives, with hands that trembled only when no one was looking. Across the diner, in the garage attached to the side of the building, Thomas tinkered with a carburetor under the harsh glow of a hanging bulb, the metallic tang of oil sharp in the air. The space was a cavern of shadows, tools scattered on workbenches like forgotten thoughts, the faint tick of cooling metal echoing from a row of bikes parked against the wall. He'd come out here to escape the crowd, the chatter of the dinner setup grating against his nerves. His daughter Mia was back home with a neighbor, her small voice on the phone earlier, asking if he'd be home for Santa. Tomas had lied, said yes, his throat tightening around the words. Single fatherhood in a place like Dustville meant choices, work or wonder, provide or play, and he'd chosen survival every time. Wiping his hands on a rag that smelled of gasoline and regret, he glanced toward the diner door, where laughter spilled out like light. The Hawks had offered to help with the overflow tables earlier, no questions asked, and Tomas had accepted with a grunt, surprised by the ease of it. These weren't the outlaws the town whispered about. They were just men, like him, carrying loads that bent but didn't break. Inside, the preparations swelled. Old Mr. Ellis shuffled in from his corner spot, helping Jack carry in a stack of chairs from the storage room, the wooden legs scraping softly against the floor. Ellis's hands shook with age, veins like rivers on a parched map, but he gripped the chairs steady, his breath coming in shallow puffs. He'd taught history once, back when Dustville had a school that didn't leak, but now he spent days recounting stories to anyone who'd listen. Tales of miners and migrants, of loyalties forged in dust storms. "You ever think about where we all end up?" he asked Jack, as they arranged the chairs in a semicircle around the main table. Jack paused, his back to the old man, the faint scent of pine from a nearby wreath brushing his nose. He didn't answer right away. Answers weren't his way. Instead, he straightened a chair, the metal frame cool under his palm, and said, "Roads lead where they lead." Ellis chuckled, a dry sound like leaves underfoot, and clapped Jack on the shoulder, a rare touch that lingered, heavy with unspoken understanding. The door swung open again, admitting a gust of cool air laced with the ozone of recent rain. More folks trickled in. A waitress from the truck stop down the road, her name tag reading Becca, carrying a pie with a lattice top cracked like fragile skin. A mechanic's apprentice, young and wiry, named Diego, who hung back by the entrance, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes wide at the spread. Becca set the pie on the dessert table, her fingers lingering on the edge, a small sigh escaping as she surveyed the room. She'd lost her brother to the road last spring, a wreck that the town blamed on speed and recklessness. But she knew better, the weight of unpaid bills, the pull of one more run. The Hawks nodded to her as she passed, Ray lifting his mug in quiet salute, and she returned it with a faint smile, the first crack in her guarded facade. As the tables filled with dishes, casseroles bubbling at the edges, bread loaves still warm from church ovens. The air hummed with a tentative warmth, the kind that fought against the desert's chill. Jack moved through it all, unseen as ever, refilling water pitchers, his boots leaving faint damp prints on the linoleum. Sarah watched him from her booth, Timmy now dozing against her side, the blanket still draped over him like a shield. "Thank you," she mouthed when he passed, her voice too soft to carry, but Jack caught it, his step faltering for a breath. He nodded, eyes meeting hers briefly, a flicker of something raw passing between them, recognition of shared margins, the quiet endurance of the overlooked. Ray leaned back in his booth, the vinyl creaking under his weight, and exchanged a look with Cole. The club had stories of their own, rides that ended in hospital waiting rooms and garages lit by regret. But here, in this diner on the edge of nowhere, they found a rhythm. Outside, the mist thickened, headlights cutting through like hesitant beacons on the empty road. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting pools of red light on the wet ground, a reminder that night was falling, and with it the dinner that would gather them all. Whispers about Jack circulated softly. Nobody. The ghost in flannel, but no one pressed. Not yet. The engines of the Hawk's bike sat silent in the lot, rain beading on chrome, waiting for the moment when loyalty would demand they roar to life. Thomas emerged from the garage, rag tucked in his belt, and joined the group at a side table, accepting a plate from Lena. The conversations flowed in low tones about weather and work, skirting the deeper currents. Becca laughed at something Diego said, her hand pausing mid-air, caught between mirth and memory. Ellis settled into a chair, his eyes on the door, as if expecting ghosts. And Jack, ever the shadow, positioned himself near the kitchen pass-through, watching the room breathe. The weight of the evening pressed in, subtle as the steam rising from the food, building toward the arrivals that would shift the fragile balance. A Santa in worn red, truths waiting to spill like overturned salt. The diner held its breath, the rain a soft percussion outside as the first toasts were raised in quiet glasses. The diner pulsed with the low murmur of voices as the Christmas dinner took shape. The air thick with the mingled aromas of sage dressing and spiced cider that cut through the lingering dampness from the rain. Folding tables groaned under the weight of communal offerings, deviled eggs dusted with paprika, green bean casseroles congealing at the edges, a ham glazed to a deep caramel sheen that reflected the overhead lights like a distant fire. Maria stood at the center of it all, her hands clasped in front of her apron, surveying the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd stitched this fragile community together, thread by thread. Her eyes, lined with the faint shadows of too many sleepless nights, softened as she watched Timmy stir from his nap, rubbing his eyes and peering at the unfolding feast. Sarah pulled him closer, her fingers absently smoothing his hair, the blanket Jack had given him now folded neatly beside her, a small talisman against the uncertainties of the road. Ray shifted in his booth, the leather of his vest creaking softly as he leaned forward to speak with Cole, their words lost in the hum of clinking silverware and muffled laughter. The Iron Hawks drew sidelong glances from the newcomers, whispers rippling like the mist outside, painting them as interlopers, rough-edged drifters who'd roll out come morning, leaving dust and discord in their wake. Becca, the waitress from the truck stop, edged past their table with a tray of rolls, her posture stiff, eyes flicking to the hawk emblem on Ray's chest. "You boys always crash the holidays like this?" she asked, her tone laced with the town's habitual wariness, the kind born from headlines about raids and rivalries that never quite reached Dustville, but cast long shadows nonetheless. Ray met her gaze steadily, his calloused hand pausing mid-reach for a roll. "Only when there's room at the table," he replied, voice low and even, no edge to it, just the weight of miles unspoken. Becca hesitated, then set the tray down, a faint nod acknowledging the olive branch, though her shoulders remained tense as she moved on. In the corner, old Mr. Ellis settled into his chair with a sigh that seemed to carry the echo of forgotten lessons, his gnarled fingers wrapping around a mug of mulled wine that steamed gently. He watched the room through half-lidded eyes, the flickering Christmas lights dancing across his weathered face like memories resurfacing. Ellis had seen generations pass through places like this, miners with lungs full of silica, families chasing jobs that evaporated like morning fog. The bikers, to him, were just another iteration of the wanderers who'd built these outposts, their loyalty a code as old as the trails. But the town clung to its judgments, Tomas voicing them quietly as he helped Diego arrange chairs, the young apprentice's enthusiasm dimming under the older man's gruff assessment. Those hawks, they look out for their own, sure. But what about the rest of us? Roll in, eat free, ride off. Diego, barely out of his teens, with grease still smudged on his cheek from the garage, glanced toward Ray's table, where Cole was now passing a plate to Sarah without a word, his massive hand gentle as it set down a serving of pie. "Maybe they're not what folks say," Diego murmured, his voice tentative, the air between them charged with the subtle shift of doubt. Jack moved through the periphery, his flannel sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms etched with faint scars that told stories no one dared ask about. He refilled salt shakers at the far end of the room, the granules whispering as they settled, his breath steady but deep, as if measuring each inhale against the press of the evening. Lena caught him there, leaning against the counter during a rare lull, her feet aching in sensible shoes worn thin at the heels. "You see that boy earlier, the way you handled him?" She trailed off, wiping her hands on a dish towel that smelled of bleach and faint vanilla. Jack's eyes lifted briefly, meeting hers in the dim glow of a pendant lamp, the light catching the silver in his stubble. He shrugged, a small motion that carried the weight of deflection, but Lena pressed on, her voice softening. "Not nobody does that without reason. Folks around here, they forget you're here, but I see it. The quiet ones hold the real stories." He paused, his hand stilling on the shaker, the glass cool against his palm, and for a moment the diner's noise faded, leaving only the patter of residual rain on the roof and the distant thrum of a truck passing on the highway. Jack nodded once, turning back to his task, but the exchange lingered, a thread pulling at the edges of his isolation. As plates were passed and chairs scraped back to make room, the room warmed incrementally, the initial stiffness giving way to tentative connections. Tomas found himself at a table with Becca and Diego, the conversation turning to the storm's aftermath, roads slick with mud, engines sputtering in the cold. Becca's laugh came unexpectedly, sharp and genuine, when Diego recounted a botched oil change that left him covered in sludge, her hand covering her mouth as if surprised by the sound. Across from them, Sarah coaxed Timmy to try a bite of cranberry sauce, his small face lighting up at the tartness, the joy a brief bloom in the somber hush. Ray observed it all from his vantage, his coffee now lukewarm, the mug's handle worn smooth from years of grip. Cole leaned in, murmuring about the club's rides through worse weathers, nights in the Mojave where sandstorms blinded you to mercy. But his tone held no bravado, just the quiet recounting of survival shared. The judgment softened in fragments. A mechanic nodding thanks as Cole steadied a wobbling table, Ellis raising his mug in silent toast to the group, acknowledging the unspoken pact that bound them all to this place, if only for the night. Outside, the mist clung to the parked bikes, beads of water tracing paths down chrome handlebars, the neon signs glowed diffused into a hazy halo. The diner held its fragile harmony, but beneath it, currents stirred, whispers about Jack growing bolder as folks settled in, his nobody status a punchline traded over bites of pie. "Handy with a mop, but ask him anything real? Vanishes like smoke," someone quipped, the words floating past Lena, who shot a glance toward the kitchen door where Jack had retreated, He stood there now, back to the room, staring at the steam rising from a pot of coffee, his reflection distorted in the stainless steel. The weight pressed heavier, the act of kindness from earlier a stone in his chest, threatening to dislodge truths best left buried. Ray's eyes found him across the space, a flicker of understanding passing unspoken, the Brotherhood's code humming like an idling engine. Protect the overlooked, even when the world labeled them shadows. The evening deepened, the first carols humming from a battered radio behind the counter, voices joining hesitantly, the melody weaving through the clatter. Timmy clapped along, his small hands a rhythm against the table, drawing smiles from unlikely corners. But as the door creaked open to admit a figure in a threadbare Santa suit, the air shifted, the man's boots leaving wet prints that Jack would later wipe away. The room turned, curiosity laced with caution, the night poised on the edge of revelation, where judgments would crack and humanity reveal its quiet veins. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The door swung shut behind the man in the Santa suit, a gust of chill air trailing him like an uninvited guest, carrying the sharp tang of wet pine from the wreath pinned to his lapel. He was no jolly figure from storybooks, tall and lean, his red velvet jacket hanging loose on a frame weathered by years under the Arizona sun. The white trim frayed at the cuffs like old rope. His beard was real, streaked with grey and trimmed close, but his eyes, sharp and knowing beneath the wire-rimmed spectacles, scanned the room with a quiet intensity that silenced the carols mid-note. The radio's tinny melody faded into the background hum of the diner, leaving only the soft scrape of forks on plates and the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the desert. Folks paused in their conversations, plates half raised, curiosity etching lines on faces softened by the warm glow of the hanging lamps. Maria stepped forward from behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour, wiping her hands on a towel as she offered a welcoming smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Evening, Frank," she said, her voice steady but laced with the familiarity of small-town orbits. Frank Harlan, that was his name, though few used it here, had been the volunteer Santa for Dustville's holidays for over a decade, showing up each year with a sack of donated toys and a demeanor that brooked no nonsense. He wasn't from the church crowd. He ran the feed store on the outskirts, a widower who'd lost his spark after his wife's passing 5 years back, but the role suited him, a way to give without asking. Tonight, though, there was something different in his step. A deliberate slowness as he adjusted the black belt cinched too tight around his waist, the buckle glinting under the lights. Ray watched from his booth, his coffee mug set down with a soft clink, the steam long dissipated into the room's humid warmth. The Ironhawks had heard tales of this Santa during stops in similar towns, the man who showed up for the forgotten, handing out more than gifts, but Frank's arrival felt heavier, like the press of an approaching front. Cole shifted beside him, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the table, fingers drumming once on the formica before stilling. Across the way, Tomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his grease-stained shirt, a skeptical furrow in his brow. "Town's Santa," he muttered to Diego, who craned his neck for a better look, the young man's eyes wide with the remnants of childhood wonder. Becca, seated nearby, paused with a roll halfway to her mouth, her expression caught between amusement and wariness. The pie on her plate cooling untouched, Frank made his way to the center of the room, the sack slung over one shoulder, thumping softly against his side, filled with wrapped parcels that rustled like dry leaves. He cleared his throat, not with a ho-ho-ho, but a low rumble that drew eyes without demanding them. "Evening, Dustville," he began, his voice gravelly from years of dust-choked shouts across store counters. "Brought a few things for the little ones, and maybe a reminder that this time of year ain't just about the food. It's about seeing what's right in front of us." His gaze swept the tables, lingering on Timmy, who sat up straighter in his booth, Sarah's hand tightening protectively on his arm. The boy's eyes lit with a spark, the blanket from Jack now tucked under his chair, like a secret kept. Jack stood frozen near the kitchen pass-through, his back to the main floor, the heat from the griddles warming his face in waves. He gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles paling under the scars, the faint scent of simmering gravy clinging to his shirt. Frank's voice pulled at him, a thread from a past he'd buried deep under layers of silence and routine. They were kin, brothers, though the town would never guess, separated by choices made in the shadow of loss. Jack's breath came shallow, measured against the rise and fall of his chest, as Frank's eyes found him in the dim corner, a flicker of recognition passing like a shadow across the Santa's face. No words yet, just that look, heavy with the weight of roads diverged. The room settled into an expectant hush as Frank knelt by Timmy's table, pulling a small package from the sack, a wooden truck, hand-carved and smooth, its wheels etched with care. "For you, son," he said, his tone softening, the lines around his eyes deepening as Timmy reached out with trembling fingers. Sarah's thanks came quick and quiet, her voice cracking on the edge of gratitude, but Frank waved it off, rising with a creak of knees. He moved then to the next table, doling out gifts with nods and murmurs, the acts simple but deliberate. A doll for a wide-eyed girl from the truck stop family, a puzzle for Diego's younger cousin visiting from Tucson. Each exchange peeled back a layer of the diner's guarded warmth, the judgments easing into something tentative, like the first break in a long drought. But it was when Frank reached the Iron Hawk's booth that the air thickened, the mist outside pressing against the windows like held breath. Ray met his gaze steadily, Cole's hand pausing mid-motion as he passed a napkin. "Heard you riders are sticking around," Frank said, handing Cole a small envelope, nothing flashy, just a card with the club's name scrawled on it, inside a voucher for feed and parts from his store. "For the road ahead, loyalty like yours. It don't go unnoticed." Cole took it without a word, his massive fingers careful, a nod the only response. But Ray saw the shift, the way Frank's eyes darted once more to Jack. The connection unspoken, but electric. The town watched, whispers stirring like steam from forgotten cups. Why the favor to the outsiders? What did Santa know that they didn't? Lena, wiping down a nearby table, caught the exchange, her cloth slowing as she glanced between the two men. Old Mr. Ellis leaned forward in his chair, mug forgotten, his breath shallow with the thrill of unfolding history. Thomas's skepticism cracked a fraction, his arms unfolding as he watched Cole tuck the envelope away, the gesture landing like quiet thunder. Becca's roll finally made it to her plate, but her eyes stayed on Frank, piecing together the fragments. The biker's unexpected help earlier, Jack's shadow in the background, the way the evening wove them all tighter. Frank straightened, sack lighter now, and turned fully toward the kitchen, the room's attention pulling taut. "And for the one who keeps this place running," he said, voice carrying clear over the hush, "the man they call Nobody." Jack turned then, slow as turning from a memory, his face half lit by the pass-through's glow, eyes meeting his brother's for the first time in years. The diner held its collective breath, the rain resuming its soft drum outside. As Frank stepped closer, the truth poised on his lips like a gift long overdue. In that moment, the small acts, the blanket, the steady hands, the unspoken nods, coalesced, shifting the fragile balance, forcing the margins to bleed into the light. The diner's lights seemed to dim under the weight of the moment, the fluorescent hum fading into a distant drone, as Frank's boots scraped softly against the linoleum, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the sudden quiet. Steam from the cooling dishes curled lazily upward, carrying the faint, bittersweet scent of cloves and overripe fruit from the punch bowl, mingling with the earthy dampness that still clung to the air from the rain. Jack stood rooted by the pass-through, his hands gripping the counter's edge, the metal warm from the kitchen's residual heat, but cold against the sudden flush rising in his chest. His breath came in shallow draws, the rise and fall of his flannel shirt, the only motion in the frozen tableau, eyes locked on Frank's, eyes that mirrored his own, shadowed by the same lines of regret etched deep from years of unspoken burdens. Frank stopped a few feet away, the Santa suit's red fabric absorbing the light like spilled blood on snow, his sack now empty and slung low over one arm. The room watched, breaths held collectively, the clatter of silverware silenced, plates forgotten mid-bite. Sarah pulled Timmy closer, her fingers trembling against his shoulder, the boy's wide eyes darting between the two men like a fawn sensing the shift in the wind. Ray leaned forward in his booth, the vinyl creaking under his weight, his jaw set in a line that spoke of roads traveled and secrets guarded. Cole's massive hand rested on the table, fingers splayed still. The envelope from Frank now tucked into his vest pocket like a talisman, its presence a quiet anchor in the swelling tension. "You've been hiding here long enough, Jack," Frank said, his voice low and steady, gravel worn smooth by time, carrying no accusation but the gravity of truths long deferred. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a faded photograph. Its edges curled from years of safekeeping, the image yellowed but clear, two young men in desert camo, arms slung around each other under a merciless sun, grins cracked wide against the backdrop of Iraqi sand. Jack's younger face stared back from the print, unlined and fierce, the man beside him, Frank, marked by the same stubborn jaw. "They call you nobody because you let 'em, but I know who you are. Brother to a fool who ran a feed store instead of enlisting again. The man who came home from the war with ghosts heavier than any rucksack." A murmur rippled through the diner, soft as the rain resuming its patter outside, but Jack's world narrowed to the photo trembling slightly in Frank's hand, his knuckles whitened on the counter, the scars pulling taut, a faint tremor traveling up his arm as memories surfaced unbidden. The blast of sand against his helmet, the acrid smoke of burning vehicles, the silence after that stretched longer than any tour. He'd ridden out after discharge, the Iron Hawks, a fleeting stop on an aimless path, their code of loyalty a balm before the guilt drove him to vanish into Dustville's shadows. No one here knew. He'd mopped floors to atone unseen, the name Nobody a self-imposed shroud. Now it frayed, threads pulling loose under Frank's gaze. Maria stepped closer, her apron twisted in her hands, the flour dusting her fingers like faint snow. "Jack, you never said," she whispered, her voice cracking on the edge of compassion, eyes searching his face for the pieces she'd missed in 2 years of shared silences. Lena paused mid-wipe of a table, her cloth dangling forgotten, breath caught in her throat as the revelation settled like dust after a gust. Old Mr. Ellis leaned forward, his mug tipping slightly, mulled wine sloshing against the rim, his eyes misting with the recognition of histories he'd only glimpsed in stories. Tomas shifted in his seat, arms uncrossing fully now, the skepticism draining from his features as he glanced toward the Hawks, piecing together the quiet helps. The chairs carried, the tables steadied, as extensions of a deeper bond. Ray rose slowly from his booth, the chair scraping back with a low groan that cut the hush, his boots thudding softly as he crossed the room. The Iron Hawks followed suit, Cole's shadow falling long across the floor, their presence a wall of leather and resolve that parted the crowd without force. "We knew some of it," Ray said, his voice rumbling like an idling engine, eyes meeting Jack's with the steady weight of brotherhood. Rode with you back in '05 after the discharge. You fixed my bike in that garage near Baghdad, hands steady when mine weren't. Then you ghosted, said the road called louder than the club. He paused, breath exhaling slow, the air between them thick with the unspoken. The Hawk's code had extended to searching, quietly, never pushing, respecting the margins Jack had chosen. Cole nodded, his massive frame still as stone, but his eyes held a flicker of the shared grief, the veteran lost to the bottle, the rides that ended in dawn breakdowns. Frank handed the photo to Jack, their fingers brushing in the exchange, calluses scraping like old promises renewed. Jack took it, the paper crinkling under his grip, his thumb tracing the faded image as a choked breath escaped him. Raw and unguarded, the diner exhaled with him, the tension coiling tighter, not from anger but the press of empathy unfolding. Becca wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, the roll on her plate now stone cold, her own loss echoing in the revelation. A brother gone to war's echo, never quite home. Diego stared, mouth agape, the puzzle gift forgotten in his lap. The boy's wonder turning to awe at the layers beneath the surface. But the moment didn't shatter, it deepened, the rain outside intensifying into a steady pour that drummed against the roof like insistent fingers. Sarah rose, Timmy in tow, and approached Jack hesitantly, her voice soft over the din. "You gave him that blanket. Like you knew." Jack looked down at the boy. The photo still clutched in one hand, and nodded once, the gesture heavy with the admission that his quiet acts weren't random. They were remnants of a man who'd protected in foxholes and now did so in shadows. Frank clapped a hand on his shoulder, the Santa suit's fabric rough against Jack's flannel, and the room stirred back to life, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Plates passed with newfound care. Ray lingered nearby, his hand resting lightly on Jack's arm, the touch a silent vow. The Hawks would stand, as always, for the overlooked. Outside, the neon sign flickered through the downpour, casting wavering red pools on the asphalt, the bikes gleaming wet under the assault. The truth hung there, reframing the evening. Nobody was a veteran, a brother, a rider who'd chosen silence over spotlight, his kindness the thread binding them all. But as the carols resumed faintly from the radio, the air hummed with unresolved currents, judgments not fully shed, loyalties tested in the quiet spaces between words. Jack folded the photo into his pocket, the weight settling deeper, knowing the road ahead, even in this diner, demanded more than revelation. It called for the courage to step into the light. The rain hammered the diner's roof like a relentless confession, each drop splintering against the metal with a sharp, insistent rhythm that drowned the radio's faint carols. Inside, the air hung heavy, saturated with the mingled scents of cooling ham and damp wool from coats piled in the corner. The warmth from bodies and kitchen lamps doing little to chase the chill seeping through the cracks. Jack stood by the pass-through, the folded photograph burning a faint outline against his shirt pocket, his fingers twitching at his sides as if testing the air for stability. Frank's hand lingered on his shoulder a moment longer, the pressure firm but fading, like an anchor lifted from mud. The Santa suit's red seemed too vivid now, a slash against the muted greys of the room, drawing eyes that had turned from curiosity to something sharper. Pity, laced with the town's ingrained suspicion. Ray stepped back, his boot sole sticking slightly to a spot of spilled gravy on the floor, the faint squelch pulling a few glances his way. He met them without flinching, his breath exhaling slow through his beard, the silver strands catching the light like frost on wire. The Iron Hawks formed a loose semicircle behind him, Cole's shadow swallowing half the counter, his chest rising in measured draws that betrayed the controlled simmer beneath. "Ain't no ghosts here," Ray said, voice low enough to carry only to those closest, but the words rippled outward, settling over the hush like oil on water. Tomas shifted in his chair across the room, the wood creaking under him. His fork paused midway to his mouth, green beans dangling forgotten. The revelation had cracked his armor. The single father's guarded nods to the bikers earlier now felt like missteps, his own absences from Mia echoing Jack's hidden wars. He set the fork down, the clink sharp in the quiet, and rubbed a hand over his jaw, eyes flicking to the window where rain blurred the neon's glow into watery streaks. Sarah clutched Timmy's hand tighter, the boy's small fingers sticky from pie, his wooden truck clutched under one arm like a shield. She searched Jack's face, her breath catching on a half-formed question, the blanket's memory weaving through her thoughts, the way it had warmed her son when the world felt coldest. You fought for places like this, she whispered, voice threading through the space between them, fragile as the mist outside. Jack's gaze dropped to the floor, tracing a scuff mark from his own boot, the linoleum's worn pattern a map of endless shifts. He nodded once, the motion pulling at the scar on his neck, a faint white line from shrapnel that itched now under the scrutiny. No words came, they never did easily. Instead, his hand rose slightly, palm up in a gesture too small for explanation, but Sarah understood, her eyes misting as she squeezed Timmy's shoulder, drawing him into her side. Lena moved first among the locals, abandoning her half-wiped table to cross the room, her sensible shoes whispering against the floor. She stopped beside Jack, close enough that he could smell the faint vanilla on her skin from the baking earlier, her hand hovering near his arm, without touching. "We've all got roads we don't talk about," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her breath, eyes holding his with the compassion of someone who'd mopped up more than spills, broken dreams left in the booths after closing. Becca joined her. The truck stop waitress's plate scraped clean now, her earlier wariness softened into something raw, her brother's ghost hovering in the shared silence. "Lost mine to it too," she murmured, nodding toward the photo's edge peeking from Jack's pocket, the admission pulling a communal exhale from the edges of the room. Diego, still wide-eyed, leaned forward from his seat, the puzzle pieces scattered on the table like unsolved fragments, his voice cracking young. "So, you're a hero or something?" The question hung, innocent and piercing, drawing a low chuckle from old Mr. Ellis in the corner, his mug finally set down with a decisive thud. Wine staining the rim like old blood, but the tension coiled tighter, not from revelation alone, but the undercurrent it stirred, the town's judgments clashing against the Hawk's unyielding code. A voice rose from the back, gravelly and edged with the beer-fueled bravado of a trucker who'd wandered in late, his coat dripping puddles near the door. "Veteran, huh? Then why hide like a damn ghost? Bikers and janitors. Sounds like trouble waiting to roll out." The words landed heavy, stirring murmurs that spread like the rain's chill, eyes turning wary again on Ray and Cole, the club's presence suddenly a threat reframed. Ray's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering under the stubble, but he didn't rise to it. Instead, he glanced at Jack, waiting for the signal. The Brotherhood's loyalty, a quiet hum beneath the surface, ready to shield without shattering the fragile peace. Jack felt it all pressing in, the photo's weight, the stares, the pull of old ghosts' demanding voice. His breath strained, chest tight, as if the desert sand still clogged his lungs, and he stepped forward, away from the counter, the first real movement since Frank's words. "Here, 'cause some fights don't end with the whistle," he said, voice rough like gravel under tires, low but carrying to the room's edges. The trucker's scoff died unspoken as Cole shifted, his massive frame a subtle barrier, eyes locking with the man's until the challenge wilted. Frank nodded from his spot, the Santa beard twitching with a faint smile, his hand adjusting the empty sack like settling a score. Outside, thunder grumbled low, vibrating the windows, the asphalt gleaming black under the assault, engines in the lot, waiting like held breaths. Maria intervened then, her voice cutting through like a steady hand on a wheel, calling for seconds on pie, drawing folks back to plates with the diner's ingrained rhythm. But the air thrummed with the escalation, the moral pull of forgiveness warring with old suspicions, Jack's truth forcing choices. Retreat or stand, expose more or let the shadows claim him again. Ray clapped a hand on Jack's back, the touch brief but solid, a silent vow amid the rising storm. Timmy watched it all, truck in hand, his small face a mirror of the room's held tension, innocence demanding the compassion that loyalty alone couldn't provide. The rain eased to a drizzle, but inside, the conflict brewed, unspoken guilts surfacing like headlights in the dark, testing the bonds that had brought them to this table on the edge of nowhere. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Jack Harlan reach more people who still believe in humanity. The drizzle tapered to a fine mist that beaded on the diner's windows like unshed tears, blurring the neon's red glow into soft halos that painted the asphalt in watery strokes. Inside, the air settled heavy, laced with the cooling remnants of gravy and the faint, metallic tang of rain-soaked earth drifting through the vents. Jack's words hung in the space, rough and unadorned, their echo fading into the low murmur of shifting chairs and cleared throats. His hand dropped to his side, fingers curling loosely against the seam of his jeans, the fabric worn thin from countless washes that had never quite erased the desert's grit. He met the trucker's gaze across the room, not with fire, but a steady weariness that carried the weight of foxholes and faded discharge papers, the kind of look that disarmed without a fist. Ray's hand remained on Jack's shoulder, the pressure light but unyielding, a tether woven from years of shared miles and midnight confessions around campfires that smelled of mesquite and regret. The Iron Hawks stood as one, their shadows merging into a quiet bulwark, Cole's breath exhaling slow through his nose, the only sound betraying the restrained force in his frame. No one moved to escalate. The code hummed beneath their leather, protect without provocation, let actions carve the truth deeper than shouts. The trucker, his bravado wilting under the collective stare, slumped back into his seat, fork scraping against his plate as he stabbed at a cold slice of ham, the clink sharp and solitary. Thomas watched from his table, his own fork abandoned now, the green beans congealing into a forgotten mound. The single father's eyes traced the lines of Jack's face, seeing echoes of his own late nights staring at Mia's empty crib, the guilt of choices that left scars invisible to the world. He rose slowly, chair legs whispering against the linoleum, and crossed to the counter, pouring a fresh cup of coffee from the urn's sputtering drip. "Here," he said, sliding it toward Jack, steam curling up like a fragile truce. No apology in words, just the gesture, black and strong, the mug's handle warm from Thomas's palm. Sarah lingered nearby, Timmy's small hand warm in hers, the wooden truck tucked under his arm like a promise kept. She didn't speak, but her free hand brushed Jack's sleeve as she passed, the touch fleeting, a nod of understanding that bridged the chasm between stranger and survivor. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide and unblinking, the blanket's fold peeking from under the booth like a remnant of shelter offered in the storm. Frank stepped back then, his Santa suit sagging slightly at the shoulders, the empty sack folded over his arm as he surveyed the room with eyes that had seen too many holidays turn from feast to fracture. He clapped Jack once more, the sound muffled, brotherly, before retreating to a corner booth, where old Mr. Ellis slid over to make space, the two men settling into a low exchange that wove history with the present. Tales of enlistments and homecomings, voices blending like the rain's fading rhythm. Lena moved through the tables with renewed purpose, her cloth folding napkins into neat squares, but her steps carried a lightness now, the vanilla scent on her skin mingling with the pie's lingering sweetness. Becca joined her, The two women clearing plates in tandem, their conversation a soft undercurrent of shared losses. The brother to war, the shifts that stole holidays, the quiet ways endurance bound them. Diego, gathering the puzzle pieces with careful fingers, glanced at the Hawks, his earlier awe tempered into respect. The grease on his cheek a badge of the garage's honest toil. The diner breathed again, conversations resuming in fragments, mechanics trading nods with Cole about carburetors that seized in the cold, volunteers passing seconds of casserole with smiles that reached deeper than before. Maria stood at the counter, her apron untied now, hands resting on the cool formica as she watched Jack accept the coffee from Tomas, the steam rising to soften the lines around his eyes. "You belong here more than most," she murmured when he passed, her voice a thread in the weave, compassion threading through the indifference she'd once shared. Outside, the mist lifted gradually, revealing the parked bikes in sharper relief. Chrome gleaming under the emerging stars, engines silent but poised, their hum a memory in the cooling night. Ray guided Jack to the Hawks' booth, the vinyls sighing under their weight as they sat, the club's presence a circle unbroken. Cole passed a plate of untouched pie, fork extended handle first, the crust flaky and golden, a small offering in the moral quiet. Jack took it, the tines cool against his fingers, and ate slowly, each bite measured against the flood of revelation. The photo's image burning in his pocket, Frank's gaze a bridge to a past reclaimed. The trucker slipped out eventually, coat over his arm, leaving a damp print by the door that Jack would mop later. No grudge held, just the road's indifferent pull. Judgments lingered in the corners, faint as the rain's scent, but forgiveness seeped in through the cracks, subtle as Thomas's coffee, Sarah's touch, the Hawks' steady watch. As the evening wound down, plates cleared and chairs stacked with soft scrapes, the group thinned, coats donned against the desert chill that nipped at the heels. Frank lingered last, helping Ellis to his feet, the old teacher's hand steady on the Santa's arm, their steps sinking like old rhythms rediscovered. Jack watched from the doorway, the diner's light spilling out behind him, casting his shadow long across the wet pavement. The Iron Hawks revved their engines one by one, the low growl vibrating through the ground, a chorus of loyalty that promised return, not abandonment. Ray paused beside him, helmet under his arm, the wind tugging at his beard. "Road's still there, brother, but so are we." Jack nodded, the photo's edge pressing against his chest, a reminder that survival wasn't solitary, that humanity thrived in the margins, forged in acts too quiet for fanfare. The diner emptied into the night, leaving Maria to lock the door, the neon sign flickering off with a final buzz, plunging the lot into starlit hush. In the silence, Jack swept the floor one last time, the broom's bristles whispering over the linoleum, gathering crumbs and echoes into neat piles. The weight lifted, not gone, but shared, loyalty a chain that bound without binding, forgiveness a road that curved toward dawn. Outside, the desert wind sighed low, carrying the faint hum of engines fading into the dark, a testament that even in the forgotten corners, hearts beat steady against the cold. Under the vast Arizona sky, where stars pierced the veil like unspoken vows, the man once called Nobody found his name in the quiet spaces between rides. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of They Called the Janitor Nobody at the Christmas dinner. Santa told them the truth about him. See you in the next one.